All right, so for this is part two of the lecture. So where we stopped last set of slides was what is verification and validation. So here let's zoom in a little bit on the verification part. As I said before, the verification is making sure that you're solving the mathematical equations correctly. So once you have some mathematical model, which is the PDE, so you say, for example, I'm solving the heat transfer problem, and you have the PDE for the heat transfer problem. Then there's two things that you have to do. First, you have to define a numerical algorithm to turn that PDE into a numerical algorithm. For example, the finite element method. And second, you have to code that numerical algorithm. So those two steps require verification. The first one is code verification, which means check that your algorithm actually solves the mathematical model. And the second one is the calculation verification, which is basically checking that you don't have any bugs in your code. So, what are some ways in which you can check the finite element code verification? And we'll talk more about this in lecture 20. One of them is called the patched test. And then, as I said, we'll come back to this. And then another one is called the manufactured solutions. And that one we'll actually do in homework 5. So for the patch test, basically you want to check some basic properties of your finite element interpolation. And a typical finite element mesh for the patch test is shown here. It's typically you have a very, very coarse mesh with a few elements, and then you're going to test things like, for example, whether or not this simple mesh can satisfy some properties of the solution, can represent some basic types of solutions. And again, we'll talk more about this in the next class. And then manufacture solutions, as for example, we'll be doing homework 5, is instead of trying to solve a problem for which you don't know the solution, you can create a solution and then find the boundary conditions that give you that solution, and then do the opposite with your code. Just apply the boundary conditions, get the solution, and see if that solution actually matches the actual solution. So that's the manufacturer solutions, and we'll do that for homework 5. In terms of calculation verification, things that you have to do are mesh convergence analysis. We've done a little bit in the lab, but not quite as much. We've done a little bit also based on a couple of the homeworks, the programming homeworks. And then basically what you want to check is that as you refine the mesh, you should be converging to a solution. So at some point, the solution shouldn't change even if you have twice as many elements. So when you've reached that point, that means that you have converged to a solution. So that's one of the things that you want to check. You want to keep track of version control. As I said, the calculation verification means that you have no bugs. So version control means keeping track of the changes that you do to a code, so that if you have verified and validated some code, if you make changes to that code, that you can keep track of those changes. And then another type of errors that you have to keep track of are discretization errors. For example, the errors that you can get based on element type or the mesh quality. So if you have very distorted elements, so you want to avoid that. So those cause errors in the solution. For the element type, this is related to the last Abacus lab. So depending on what element you choose, if you choose linear elements or quadratic elements, they give different power of approximating the solutions. So based on that choice, you should expect more or less error in the solutions. So we've also talked a little bit about that. And then integration, we've also talked about full integration versus reduced integration. So all of these aspects play into the errors that you can get from your finite element solution compared to the actual solution of the PDE. And so those things are things that you have to keep track of. And then another thing that you want to do is you want to do sensitivity analysis. So you want to check or uncertainty quantification. You want to make sure that you do simulations with a range of input parameters. So not just a single set of parameters, but you want to change the material properties, the boundary conditions, the geometry, and you want to see how sensitive your solution is to these changes. Because, for example, rarely you'll have the exact geometry or the exact material or the exact boundary conditions for a problem. So you want to know how important are those details that you're going to miss. So if you get a part to analyze, for example, and then you cannot represent the exact geometry, if you are going to have some features that you're not going to discretize, for example, how big of an impact does that have on the actual solution? So you should definitely do some sensitivity analysis on your solution as well. In terms of the validation, as I said before, the validation is to check whether or not your computational model describes the physical reality. So for that, you actually have to do experiments. You don't want to do experiments that are way too expensive. You don't want to do experiments for every single simulation that you do. So you can imagine if you are designing a part, and then you have some finite element model for that part, and you want to validate that that model represents the reality, the stress and strain distribution that that part will undergo in the setting where it will operate. Well, chances are that it's very difficult to replicate the exact situation that that part is going to be working under in the real setting. But in order to validate that your model will be accurate, maybe you can design an experiment in which you don't have the exact same part in the exact same situation, but you might have something that is close enough. And this is related to what I asked you to do for your project, which is you want to have a reference solution. So we don't have the opportunity to do experiments in this class. So instead of experiments, what I ask you to have in order to have a validation of your model is to have a reference solution. But typically what you would do is you would actually try to do some experiments. And again, the experiments don't have to be the super complicated part with the super complicated loading. Rather, you want to set up a simplified problem that you can solve with your finite element code, but that you can also do an experiment on. So instead of the complicated part, maybe a simpler part with simpler boundary conditions that you can actually do the experiment, then you do the simulation, then you compare the two. Again, in your project, this will be the reference solution. So you want to do a simplified model, compare that to the reference solution. Then once you see that those two match, then you want to take your model and then actually simulate the thing that you are interested in. So change the geometry, change the boundary conditions to the actual application. Um, and then in terms of uh, also the validation, one of the things that you want to do to validate your model is you want to assess how accurate that is. So you want to quantify, you want to objectively measure the difference between the experimental solution and the experimental measurements and the simulation. How do you do that? You want to have redundancy of data, so you want to repeat experiments so that you establish confidence in the repeatability of the experiments, and you want to measure more than one thing. So you don't only want to measure a single strain at a single point, but you maybe want to measure both some load and some strains. So multiple things basically. And then uncertainty quantification, then you want to be able to know, for example, if you expect some error in the measurement process. Some examples of how to validate, how to do experiments. For stress analysis, there's techniques such as photoelasticity. So what you can see there is the stress profile by compressing some disk. You don't actually see the stress profile, but you can compute the stress profile based on these patterns of interference and light. So you shine some light through some object that is translucent, and then these patterns tell you about the stress field. So you can use this to calculate the stress field and validate your solution. Now you can use strain gauges, and then you can also do you can have load cells and DIC, which is digital image correlation, which is you have a speckle pattern on a part, and then you apply some forces, and then you can calculate the strain field. So for example, in these images shown here, you can calculate the strain field of a plate with a hole, and then this should look familiar. And this is experimental. So this one here, it's not from a finite element simulation, but it's measured experimentally based on this deformation of the speckle pattern through DIC. So then you can use this to validate whether or not your finite element solution actually produces this strain profile. And so what types of PDEs can be solved with the finite element method? We have talked a lot about the heat transfer problem for the 2D. We did both heat transfer and elasticity for 1D. And the finite element method that we have discussed so far works really well for that equation. And I'm not going to get into the details of why that is the case, but that is an elliptic equation. And there's other equations that you might have that represent some physics that you might want to solve with the finite element method. A common one is the advection diffusion equation. This is the strong form shown here in the slides. You can see that this part and this part look like the standard heat transfer problem, but this part doesn't. This part is a transport term. And then the problem with this type of equation is that if you apply blindly the finite element method that we have talked about in the class, you will get some stiffness matrix, you will get an extra matrix over here. You can pose the discretization, get the system of equations, you'll be able to solve it. But you have to be really careful because this, if you solve it just blindly, this can be unstable. I don't have a finite element solution here. This is actually a finite difference solution, but it's the same phenomenon that happens in the finite element method, which is when you do standard finite element discretization that we've talked about for transport problems, then you can get unstable solutions. So here you can see the exact solution is this red curve, and then the numerical solution is this blue curve. So you can see here that, and this is a transport problem. So this wave basically propagates from left to right. And you can see that as the red wave moves, it shouldn't change in shape. So it should be basically the exact same shape as it moves through the domain. But if you solve it with a standard central finite difference in this case, but the finite element method would do the same, you would get these oscillations that grow as you solve the problem. So here you can see a small oscillation, and then as you continue to solve the problem, you get bigger oscillations. And so those oscillations happen in the finite element method when you have this advection term. So bottom line is the FE that we've talked about works really well for the standard heat transfer problem, the standard linear elasticity problem with no constraints. But if you want to solve an advection problem, for example, you need something called stabilization terms. The details are not important for this class because we don't have time to go over the fix, the details, but the main message is diffusion is okay, you can trust your FE solution. Advective transport may be an issue, so you have to check whether or not you have oscillations in your solution. If yes, most FE packages will have an option to add stabilization terms. We won't cover those in class, and you probably have to check a little bit of that documentation on your own. That's it.